Hi everyone, welcome to another SBIS webinar. Today we'll be talking about Suffolk woodland plant communities. Areas of woodland can be found scattered throughout the East Anglian region, but there is a great variation at the local level in the amount of woodland present and in the plant communities that they support. Natural woodland tends to evolve over long periods of time and is often considered to be climax habitat, the end result of a succession of habitats that develop during prolonged periods of settled climate. By contrast, planted woodland or plantations typically show uniform tree density and height, with a resulting limit to the variety of associated plant species. Trees dominate woodland, and the classification of woodlands is largely based upon the species present. Most obviously, different are deciduous versus coniferous woodlands, but subtle differences in soil and aspects can result in different species of deciduous tree coming to dominate, and this can result in differences in the ground flora. As well as differences in the species composition, woods can differ in the density of trees, with older, more natural woodland often having gaps provided by aging and fallen trees, and this can provide open glades rich in wildflowers. Oak ash woods. So this constitutes the primary woodland type in East Anglia and particularly occurs on the boulder clays from South Norfolk to North Essex, but can also be found elsewhere too. Typically, stands that are on wetter soils have a higher ash content, while drier soils have more oak. European ash and pedunculate oak are the dominant species and often have an understory of European holly and European hazel. In this picture here, we can see an unmanaged oak ash woodland, and it's got that understory of holly, which is limiting the potential for rich ground flora. Within oak ash woodlands, other tree species are often present in smaller quantity, and depending on the soil type, this can include sycamore, small-leaved lime, hornbeam, goat willow, both smooth-leaved and winch elm, and sweet chestnut. Some of these will have been planted, but others can be either planted or occur naturally. In this picture here, you can see some managed oak ash woodland with coppiced hazel after 2 years of cutting. Oak ash woods have long been managed for wood products, with the 2 tree species being left to provide mature timber and the understory being coppiced on a rotational basis. These management practices produce periodic clearings in the woodland before the understory regrows, and such woods are our most species-rich for wildflowers, with carpets of many species colouring the ground in late spring, especially common bluebells, common primrose, ramsons, or wild garlic, and European wood anemone. In this picture you can see managed oak ash woodland with a well-grown understory of coppiced hazel. This is another example of an oak ash woodland, and actually on wetter soils it can develop a rich ground layer of ferns and sedges along the open rides and glades. Next, let's talk about oak birch woods. So these form woodlands dominated by pedunculate oak and silver or downy birch, which typically develop on acidic, often dry and sandy soils, and most often appear as a succession to heathland, where the heath has not been managed. Birches spread exceptional amounts of seed, and birch colonisation of heathland can be a major headache for managed heath reserves. Where a woodland develops, the canopy is typically relatively low, perhaps because of the dry conditions suppressing growth, and both European holly and common rowan are often present. The birches can often grow quite densely, crowding out all but common bracken, which can cover the ground layer. The picture here has a poor ground layer consisting typically of just common bracken. The oak birch woodlands can look very barren in the winter and early spring. If the woodland has developed on former heathland, then relics of that habitat may persist where there are gaps in the canopy. Isolated pockets of common and bell heather, heath bedstraw, and common or western gorse may persist, while common honeysuckle can be frequent. Because of the typically dry conditions, ferns, with the exception of bracken, are usually absent. In such wetter places, the ground layer can contain more species and often has a good layer of ferns and sedges. In this picture we can see an oak birch woodland that has developed on wetter ground and has a good population of this broad buckler fern beneath the trees. Moving on to beechwood. The beech tree species is widespread, especially on drier soils in the southwest of the region. Elsewhere, European beech has been widely planted in the grounds of many stately homes, where individual trees grow large and spreading in the open parkland environments. The species has also been planted in narrow plantations along several of the roads through Breckland, and in full autumn colour or vivid green spring flush they are a feature of the area. In this picture you can see stands of European beech in Breckland brighten up the scene along the roadside and relieve the darkness of the extensive pine plantations in that area. Beech leaves are quite leathery and tannic, and after falling to the ground they take quite a long time to break down. Because of this, a ground flora struggles to develop, and beech stands typically hold few mosses and brambles at their feet. In this picture here, we can see European beeches planted in parkland habitats, and they are quite openly spaced, which allows a few grasses to form a ground layer, especially creeping soft grass, which does quite well in shade. In some places, European holly can develop as an understory, especially in places where smaller stands of beech are found within a mosaic of other woodland types. Let's talk about other deciduous woodlands. So smaller but no less important areas of deciduous woodland with either a wide range of dominant tree species or with different species dominating can be found scattered around a region. Some are the result of plantings, such as sweet chestnut stands, while others may be relics of older habitats that are now more scarce in our region. Woodlands of small-leaved lime seem to have declined along with the changes in woodland management regimes, while healthy stands of the once widespread small-leaved elm are now a rarity. Some woods have been deliberately planted, typically either for shooting practices or for timber, on private estates, and these can have almost an untold variety of trees, and if nothing else, they're good for sharpening up your tree identification skills. In this picture we can see some unnatural association of mixed evergreen and deciduous species on a common estate, but that's not to say they don't harbour an interesting understory and ground layers, especially when they are naturally allowed to age and regrow. Many woodland blocks have subtle variations in the soil type and moisture content, and this can often produce a mosaic of varying tree associations. Species such as field maple, wild cherry, common rowan and hornbeam often occur in mixed associations, while bird cherry can be plentiful in some damp Breckland woodlands, where it is thought to be at its southernmost limit in the UK. In this picture we can see that on shooting estates, rhododendron has been widely planted, and that's just this dense plant that's here on the left. Along with evergreens such as cherry laurel and both Lawson's and Leyland cypress to provide cover for pheasants. Sadly, this has largely voided areas of woodland of their ground flora, while the pheasants themselves also cause damage to native plant populations. Organisations such as the National Trust have worked hard to remove such species from their properties. Sycamore was originally introduced to the UK, but has rapidly become a major component of wooded areas, especially where rapid successional growth has occurred on former brownfield sites and other places where the ground has been disturbed. It often has a poor ground flora because of past soil nitrification and or disturbance, and many stands have a ground layer dominated by common nettle and various brambles. However, there are some interesting stands with a bluebell ground layer, which may have evolved over time as a result of removal of former native trees. In this picture we can see a wood planted with pendiculate oak, sweet chestnut and beech, co-dominated with self-sown sycamore, a common association in East Anglia in many places. In this picture we can see coppiced hornbeam, which is occasionally seen in our area, especially towards the southwest of the region. Woodland or copses with mature, smooth-leaved elm were once a feature of Suffolk and East Anglia, but have been wiped out by Dutch elm disease. A very few stands do remain. Elms still survive as suckering growth, especially in hedgerows, but they seldom reach maturity before the disease knocks them back down to the ground again. Elms still survive as suckering growth, especially in hedgerows, but they seldom reach maturity before the disease knocks them down again. Let's move on to talk about wet woodland and carr. While oak ash woodland can do well on reasonably damp ground, more or less permanently wet ground in valley bottoms and bordering lakes and the Broads is typically colonised by woodlands containing alder and willow. The term carr is used to indicate low canopy woodland or scrub in wetland habitats, with alder carr being dominated by European alder and willow carr, typically consisting of a range of shrubby willow species, such as grey willow in East Anglia, but sometimes also almond, purple and eared willows. Alder carr can eventually develop into alder woodland. In this picture, we can see patches of transitional wet woodland that can develop around seepages and streams in oak ash woodland. Such sites often contain sycamore and the first European alders, and an interesting ground flora can develop in the wet mud, including various sedges and ferns. Extensive alder carr and alder woodland exists throughout the Broads and along the upper reaches of the Little Ouse and Waveney, as well as elsewhere, but is particularly a feature of the Bure and the Yare in Norfolk. A dangerous quagmire of quaking bog or hoover can develop around the tree roots and develops interesting plant communities dominated by various sedges and patchy stands of common reed. Many wetland plant species find a home in such places and are best viewed by visiting dedicated nature reserves with boardwalks that allow access into the habitat. In this picture here we can see a typical wet willow carr in the winter. This picture is showing us alder carr in the spring, and you can see a good range of sedges that are dominating the ground layer. And lastly, this picture is showing us mature mixed alder and willow carr and alder woodland that can hold a very diverse ground layer. Let's talk about coniferous woods. Britain only has 3 native conifer species. It's Scots pine, European yew, and common juniper. All are thought to have been native in East Anglia at some point in the past, but native distributions, even if they still exist, have been blurred or lost to interpretation by widespread planting of these 3 species throughout the region. While native coniferous habitats have been lost, there has been extensive planting of non-native conifers since as early as the late 17th century, and much planting was carried out into the 20th century, both on Forestry Commission land and as private enterprises. In this picture here, you can see the typical gloom under a dense planting of Douglas fir and ground fir, and firs, hemlock, spruces and cypresses have even denser foliage than do pines, and many plantations can have virtually no ground layer of plants. The typical gloom under a dense planting of Douglas fir and ground firs is not very encouraging for the ground layer or for flora. East Anglia's generally drier climate does not suit many of the conifers from western North America that have been so widely planted in the British uplands, and most plantings have been of Scots or Corsican pine, though there have been plantations of European and hybrid larch, Douglas fir and western red cedar too. In addition to plantations, introduced conifers have been planted to stabilise coastal dunes and as shelter belts in cropped areas. Specimen plantings of iconic species such as great redwood and monkey puzzle have also been widespread on private estates and in parks. In the picture you can see here, the ground beneath this plantation of Lawson's cypress, western hemlock spruce and western red cedar is dominated by a carpet of germinating conifer seedlings from the parent trees, further reducing any opportunity for natural plant cover. The plant communities that develop in conifer plantations are greatly reduced by the lack of light under the trees. The dense evergreen foliage of conifers shades out a high percentage of the light, and this is even more the case in plantation forestry, where the trees tend to be planted particularly close together. Plant communities tend to reflect those that were present at the time of planting, though in a greatly reduced form, while the dense mat of shed conifer needles can not only reduce the ground layer further, it can also serve to acidify the ground, again affecting plant species that can survive. In this picture, we see a few evergreens can sometimes form a shrub layer in conifer plantations, though they are often non-native species, such as common Oregon grape in Brookland, or, as we can see here, European rhododendron on the private estates. Most plantation conifers do best on acidic soils, and this is reflected in where they are planted, as well as the fact that heathland was not farmable and therefore ripe for plantation use. Thus, plant communities tend to be those of acidic grassland, and this is readily demonstrable along the more open forest rides and trackways through Brookland. Extensive conifer plantation covers huge areas of the Brookland and part of the Suffolk sandlings that otherwise would have been heathland, while smaller scale plantings are scattered on more neutral soils through the region. In this picture we can see plantations or shelter belts of larch trees can be more open due to the deciduous nature of the trees, and actually this can aid in the development or retention of a more species-rich ground layer of plants. Next, let's talk about wood pasture and parkland. So wood pasture refers to a suite of open woodland types that largely evolved through the human use of woodland. Woodlands were transformed by prolonged periods of livestock grazing, the result of which was to produce a range of habitats from open woodland to parkland. Grazing reduced the quantity of woody plants, including sapling trees, and allowed more light in, opening up the habitat to colonisation by grassland species. Where tree cover remained more dense, brambles and bracken typically became dominant. In this picture here we can see wood pasture dominated by peduncular oak and silver birch, suggesting that this area developed from oak-birch woodland. Sweet chestnut also has been introduced. The ground layer is dominated by grasses tolerant of heavy grazing, with patches of bramble developing too. Through some parklands around stately homes, we can see they were created by planting up open ground, Others evolved into parkland through grazing by sheep and herds of fallow deer. Wood pasture was probably a dominant habitat type in lowland Britain in the past, particularly before enclosure laws. However, most woodland pasture has now been lost, either reverting back to denser woodland or becoming arable land according to later land use. In this picture we can see parkland on a larger private estate, typically that's more open, with scattered specimens of trees of peduncular oak and often cedar of Lebanon and holm oak. Replacement plantings for lost specimens are protected from browsing livestock when young. The plant communities that might develop in wood pastures is dependent on levels of shade and soil type. The communities are highly variable and effectively represent a gradient from woodland flora to grassland flora. In this picture we can see the effects of livestock grazing on trees, and you can see the browse line here, very definitive. Heavy grazing pressure and high nutrification from droppings can also result in extensive colonies of common nettle developing. And those are all the main communities of woodland that you might find in Suffolk. Some recommended resources to explore are Suffolk Wildlife Trust's habitat pages. They have specific woodland habitat pages with the same kind of information that we've been through today. On our website at SBIS we also have pages on various habitats, and I would highly recommend Flora of East Anglia, an identification guide website by Mike Crew. All of the information used today has come from that website, and I would highly recommend having a look through. Not only does he list the woodland plant communities, but he also lists associated species of ground flora and tree species that you will find associated with those woodland communities. Thanks so much for listening, and all the best with your woodland surveying.